let's begin. Can a price be put on a human life? When it came to the 18-year-olds Gwen and Alicia, their lives were worth $1,200. Shortly after turning 18, Gwen and her best friend Alicia traveled to Gwen's aunt's house. There, they were introduced to a man named Brian Forbes. Little did they know they were introduced to a pimp. Gwen's aunt had set them up. Forbes took both girls through a period called seasoning, during which he wined and dined them in order to gain their trust. After this period, both girls were held captive in a Holiday Inn, where they testified to being padlocked in the room with the windows nailed shut. Johns, a prostitute's customer, frequented their rooms daily. After a couple months with Forbes, both girls were sold to a man named Dennis Paris for $1,200. With him, their sexual abuse continued, and one man in the Paris organization was even given the order to murder Alicia, though fortunately, this was never carried out. Stories like this are prevalent all across America. The only way to stop sexual abuse of this nature is to adopt the Nordic model of prostitution legislation. What this entails is that the selling of sex will be legal, but the buying of it will stay criminalized, thus effectively protecting the women in the sex trade. Though this is good for both genders, this speech will concentrate on the women in the sex industry. There are three main types of prostitution legislation that I will discuss in this speech. They are the Nordic model, the German model, and the American legislation. First, the Nordic model. Sweden's decision to create and adopt the Nordic model of legislation, that is, to criminalize the buying of sex and to legalize the selling of sex, has been successful. They have met the humanitarian goals of reducing the They have met their humanitarian goals of reducing prostitution nationwide, thus protecting the women who are forced into sex slavery, and they have reduced the amount of trafficking that has victims being forced into Sweden. Furthermore, the Nordic model takes the focus of the law from the prostitutes and puts it on the pimps and johns. Though the selling of sex is legal under the Nordic model, the pimps, the human sex traffickers, will still be considered criminals, unlike the women in the sex trade. All this is to say that the prostitutes, the victims, will not be arrested, but the pimps and johns, the true criminals, will. Second is the German model. Germany took a controversial stance when it legalized prostitution. Everywhere across the countries, brothels have opened up and have become available to the public. It is estimated that 400,000 prostitutes cater to over 1 million men per day in just that country alone. Germany created the German model, the full legalization of prostitution, with the goal of reducing human trafficking in their country. This has been a total failure. In 2010, well after the creation and subsequent adoption of the German model in 2002, German police struggled to fight a rise of sex trafficking of increasingly young women. Third is the American system of legislation. In America, human trafficking is proving to be an issue no matter if prostitution is completely legal or completely illegal. In parts of Nevada, prostitution is legal, whereas in the rest of the country, it is unlawful. The pimp, prostitute, and customer, also known as a john, are all at risk of imprisonment, but the prostitutes are arrested at a much higher rate. 70% of those arrested for sex crimes are the female prostitutes. 20% are male prostitutes, and 10% are the pimps and johns. As punishment, a prostitute can see anywhere from 1 day to 2 years of imprisonment for only their first offense. Human trafficking is a prevalent crime all throughout the world. Specifically, in America, over 14,500 people are illegally trafficked into the country each year. On a worldwide scale, 80% of human trafficking committed is of a sexual nature. Furthermore, the average cost of a slave is only $90, proving that this problem is lacking a solution. Many women enter into the sex trade for different reasons. The majority are forced to it, but some turn to the sex work because they are faced with extreme poverty or drug addiction. This means that sex workers as a whole are not always innocent. Many women enter into the sex trade, but a very small portion leave it. Out of 854 female prostitutes interviewed in 9 countries, 89% said that they wanted to escape the sex trade. This alarming statistic raises the question, if so many decided to enter into the sex trade themselves, why do they not simply leave it? These women stay in prostitution because they are forced to be there. The pimps, Johns, and the law force women to stay in the sex trade in many different regards. Pimps hold prostitutes hostage because the demand of the Johns is so high. The legislation keeps the women in the sex trade because it makes it very difficult for women to leave and find gainful employment elsewhere, because very few people would hire someone who was arrested for this kind of sex crime. Though not all sex workers are innocent, they are all oppressed. The decision to enter into the sex trade may sometimes be freely made, but the choice to leave it is never easy. Mark P. Lagon, the former global politics and security chair at Georgetown University, said that, quote, prostitution is not the oldest profession. It is the oldest form of oppression. This shows the tension in this modern form of slavery. Because the current legislation outlaws prostitution as a whole, sex workers are being wrongfully targeted. To protect the oppressed women in America, America must adopt the Nordic Model and legalize the selling of sex so as to keep the oppressed prostitutes safe, while arresting the pimps and Johns. Under this new set of laws, first, the psychological, second, the physical, and third, the social safety of female prostitutes will be upheld. Not only is this a radical change from the current system that abuses oppressed sex workers, it will greatly improve their quality of life. As a result of pimps, Johns, and prostitution itself, the psychological safety of female sex workers is being harmed. American women in the sex trade are often raped, verbally abused, and beaten by pimp and John alike. These actions take an extreme psychological toll on the women. In a study that spanned across 9 countries, it was found that in 2003, 68% of female sex workers met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Furthermore, sex workers as a whole have developed a sort of split personality. Because many prostitutes consider their work as paid rape, they are constantly distancing themselves from their situation. They describe their life in 2 sections. They have their true personality during the day. They go shopping, they eat out, and they try desperately to live a normal life. During their work, the women immediately distance themselves from their circumstance. They numb themselves to all that is going on around them. One French sex worker says that, quote, if I wake up to this double personality while I'm working, I realize only too well that I'm not what I should be, what I would want to be. Those times are the hardest, end quote. This causes severe depression. A study done in 1993 found that 75% of female North American prostitutes had attempted suicide. Without the Nordic Model, without the selling of sex being legal, these women are left to fend for themselves. As a result of the fact that prostitution as a whole is illegal under the current American legislation, the care centers that are already in place are woefully inadequate. Because the selling of sex is illegal, women in the sex trade rarely seek the aid that they so desperately need. If the Nordic Model is to be adopted, more provisions in the legislation will be made specifically for more sex workers to have more readily available care centers. Without this, oppressed women in the sex trade will continue to suffer psychologically with little to no hope for remedy. Many people who disagree with the Nordic Model and advocate for the German model would argue that the full legalization of prostitution would negate any and all adverse psychological effects. The logic in this argument is that if something is legal, it will cause very few negative consequences because people will be treated with respect. This is wholly untrue. Significant portions of young girls are trafficked into Germany for sex work each day. If opponents of the Nordic Model, the legalization of the selling of sex, were correct in saying that the total legalization of prostitution is safer for everyone, human trafficking would be reduced greatly. This deals with the psychological safety of prostitutes because trafficking causes major mental harm. This does not change the evidence I said earlier. In 2010, it was found that over half of trafficked victims showed severe signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. The German model is not the solution to the problem of psychological safety because with higher human trafficking rates comes more and more mentally debilitated women. Due to the current American legislation, oppressed sex workers are operating in physically unsafe circumstances. Because the selling of sex is illegal, many prostitutes are being arrested. As I previously stated, 70% of those arrested for sex crimes are female prostitutes, 20% are male prostitutes, and only 10% are the pimps and johns. Clearly, the police are targeting the victims, not those manipulating the sex workers. This statistic is especially alarming when taking into account the fact that where the legislation fails, so does the means of rehabilitation for prostitutes. Mary Bohannon had been arrested several times for prostitution charges by the time she turned 19. When she finally reached that age, she was arrested again and sent to the Rock River Academy in Illinois, a rehabilitation center. There, her sexual, verbal, and physical abuse continued under the hands of other residents and staff alike. Each night, she and a couple of her friends would escape the care center and prostitute themselves further in the city as their only form of solace. This is just one example of the law failing sex workers. Under the Nordic Model, the selling of sex would be legal. Because of this, girls like Mary Bohannon would not be treated as criminals. Instead, they would be treated and seen as oppressed women and receive the care that they deserve. Furthermore, even though every prostitute has the right to report any crimes committed against them and not be prosecuted, the majority feel threatened by the law and endure much more physical harm as a result. The reason for this type of behavior from women is the fact that the selling of sex is illegal. Stories like the one of Gwen and Alicia are dreadfully common. Gwen, Alicia, and hundreds of other women and girls are subjected to rape, abuse, and many other forms of sexual violence under the hands of johns and pimps. These girls are forced to live under these circumstances because the pimps manipulate the girls' knowledge of the law to serve more nefarious purposes. A reader of the publication, Star News, asked why police are not arresting prostitutes at a higher rate. F.T. Norton, the reporter, responded by saying that police are more closely monitoring sites like Craigslist in order to further crack down on prostitution. This is just one of the many problems of the current poor American legislation. The police are continuing to arrest victims of human trafficking. In order for women to feel safe and live in a caring-free, violence-free environment, America must adopt the Nordic Model and legalize only the selling of sex. Those who disagree with the Nordic Model are quick to say that the total legalization of prostitution will help sex workers avoid physical abuse in their work. This is not the case. In Colombia, where prostitution is completely legal, from 2008 to 2012, 50,000 children, most of them girls, were victims of sexual abuse. The majority of these children were also victims of human sex trafficking. This terrible series of events shows that the complete legalization of prostitution will not lead to safe prostitution. In their everyday lives, the social safety of female sex workers is constantly being infringed upon. Many sex workers are subjected to verbal abuse from pimps, johns, and police. Whether on the streets or in an official police report, prostitutes are referred to in a derogatory manner. Michelle Vuong, a known prostitute, was on her way to a social event when two police officers shouted from their car, quote, "No hooking," end quote. Michelle didn't look at them, she didn't say anything, and she simply continued on her way. Apparently, this was the incorrect response. The two police officers stepped out of their car, slammed her into a wall, punched her in her ribs, and scratched her hard enough to leave welts. Then, they arrested her. This story proves the inner social turmoil that sex workers face each day. Because prostitution is illegal under the current American legislation, police dehumanize and demonize women in the sex trade, leaving them to feel hopeless and lost. As a result of this outlook and the public's view of prostitutes, these American women have no upward mobility. The Nordic model, the legalization of the selling of sex, would radically improve this situation. 89% of those in the sex trade went desperately to leave it. These women would be free to do so under the Nordic model because police would no longer target them. Therefore, employers would be more willing to hire them. Currently, it is very difficult for former prostitutes to find work outside the sex trade. Nicole was arrested over 20 times for drug and prostitution charges and struggled to find a job that would keep her as an employee after they found out that she had been a prostitute. When her child turned 2, Nicole was faced with a 9-month prison sentence for a very old prostitution charge. Nicole suffered through all of this because a man she was dating sold her to a pimp for $2,000. Because of the current American legislation and the fact that the selling of sex is illegal, women just like this are not granted a second chance. Because when you fill out a job application, you have to answer the question if you have a criminal record, prostitutes cannot find gainful employment. When employers look through your job application and they see that you answered yes to having a criminal record, this raises an immediate red flag. Few people would read past this question if you answered yes and would deny you outright. Those who oppose the Nordic model accuse it of being woefully inadequate when it comes to protecting the social safety of sex workers. In Nevada, there are several small counties with legal brothels operating inside of them. One such establishment is Sherry's Ranch. The women there are seen as independent contractors, not prostitutes. This is a result of the fact that women who wish to do sex work are required to hold a valid Nevada state business license. The legal prostitution carried out in Nevada is highly regulated, thus the women are not seen as criminals. This example that the supporters of complete legalized prostitution use is flawed because it fails to recognize the fact that in and of itself, prostitution is harmful. Whether completely legal or completely illegal, prostitution directly leads to the objectification and dehumanization of women. As one publication puts it, quote, "Men who participate in buying a prostitute view women as mere sex objects and not human beings," end quote. This fact goes to prove that the complete legalization of sex work is not the correct response. It only exacerbates the problem. The Nordic model, the legalization of only the selling of sex, is the best way to uphold the social safety of female sex workers. In conclusion, it is clear that America must adopt the Nordic model. Because America has made the selling of sex illegal in the vast majority of the country, oppressed women are suffering psychologically, physically, and socially. Not only are these women prisoners of their pimps, they are raped, beaten, and abused, both metaphorically and physically, by society and customer alike. Only by implementing the Nordic model, thus legalizing only the selling of sex, will these women be safer from mental, bodily, and social harm. If the Nordic model were to be adopted in America, situations like the one that Gwen and Alicia experienced would be much less common. Fewer girls would be sold into sexual slavery because once the law targets pimps and johns specifically, the demand for prostitution decreases significantly. When Sweden legalized the selling of sex but criminalized the buying of it, the country saw a decrease in online advertisements and no increase in prostitution. Many Americans think that prostitutes are only imprisoned by their pimps. What they do not see is that the existing body of laws is doing the exact same thing. The Nordic model, legalizing only the selling of sex, will give the women in the sex trade a second chance. Adopting the Nordic model is not just the humanitarian thing to do, it is the right thing to do. Thank you.
seen the poisonous fruit of human trafficking and sex trafficking all over the world. It's an extraordinarily serious problem, and I commend you, Phil, for tackling it as directly as you have. An issue that's very controversial. And there's part of me that heard friends of mine my age saying that you left out a fourth option, which is total, absolute, unbarred, illegal prostitution and the buying of it, the selling and the buying. And I would think that a lot of evangelicals would think that is the answer, and we just haven't tried hard enough. Is there any place where that has been done successfully, so that prostitution is done away with, essentially, by making it illegal to sell your body and making it illegal to buy someone's body? Has that ever been tried? And if it has been tried, what were the costs of that?
Right.
And
well,
results?
Right. As Christians, we do know that prostitution itself is wrong, and the Nordic Model's goal is to reduce prostitution. But in my research, I found that no legislation will outright stop prostitution. The best thing that you can do is simply reduce it. Originally, America did completely prostitution itself was completely illegal in America for many years. It wasn't until recently was prostitution legalized in only a few small counties in Nevada. The result of the complete illegalization of prostitution was higher human trafficking rates and higher prostitution rates. So America is just one example of the complete illegalization of prostitution failing. In my research, I didn't come across a single instance where that type of legislation was successful.
And I can imagine the kind of police powers that would be necessary to even pretend that it's being done.
Right.
So it's another cause. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd like to ask you about the consequences of saying that prostitution is legal, right? I mean, you just said that we as Christians know that it's wrong. If we make it legal, it seems to me that the world might perceive that as us saying, actually, it's okay.
Right.
Couldn't we, instead of making it legal as Sweden has, lower the penalties, maybe seal criminal records for former prostitutes who have successfully rehabilitated themselves, increase the prosecution of Johns and pimps, but not make prostitution itself legal?
That is one way that you could approach it, but at the same time, it's still criminalizing the acts of so many women who are victims of sex trafficking. The majority of these women want to leave the sex trade, 89% of them, but they simply cannot because the current law, because of the way it works, they just cannot. Even just by reducing the amount of, the punitive measures taken against these prostitutes, or even, as you said, sealing the criminal records, the fact still stands that these women, these oppressed women, are still seen as criminals, and therefore they themselves will still encounter instances of depression, because even though they're forced to be there, the law isn't fully recognizing that, and they just won't feel like they have a second chance at a new life.
So, another second question. Similar arguments are made for legalizing drugs.
Right.
Right. And some places, some states have legalized marijuana, but that marijuana is a mild drug compared to others, particularly those that are most parallel to prostitution, sex trafficking equation. Do you think that we can apply the same reasoning that Sweden has applied here to, say, methamphetamine and heroin? If we made those legal, would there be a decrease in gang violence and organized crime?
My research didn't necessarily go into that, but I can still speculate. I think because the Nordic model's goal, Sweden's goal, was simply to reduce prostitution in their country, it successfully reduced prostitution in its country, and it did reduce human trafficking. It can be argued that that same approach will help reduce, as you said, gang violence and even drug use in some instances. But to be honest, I just don't know if this approach will work for anything else besides prostitution legislation specifically.
Great, good job, Phil. I'm curious, are there active efforts to have the Nordic model put into, a bill on the Hill or something like that?
In Europe, it's very popular already. Since its inception in the 90s, 8 countries in Europe have already adopted it. More countries, specifically England, are working on their own versions of it so they can successfully implement it in their country. But unfortunately, it hasn't quite crossed the Atlantic Ocean yet, even though it's very popular, not to mention successful in Europe. America, in the legislature, it just hasn't fully caught on yet.
Who opposes the idea the most?
Well, it's mostly an argument between, I guess, just certain groups like feminist groups. There's one Swedish feminist, Petra Ostergren, who despises the Nordic model. She has had countless interviews with prostitutes saying that they have to operate in more physically unsafe circumstances in order to negotiate with kind of seedier clients. But this fails to recognize the fact that the goal of the Nordic model is to reduce prostitution, not to allow prostitution continue and just arrest the pimps instead of that. So it's mainly a war between two feminist groups, those who think prostitution is inherently good and thus should be allowed to continue, and those who know that prostitution is very bad for all parties involved and know that it must be reduced.
Who's advocating for the Nordic model in the United States? Are there any leaders in the movement that you know of?
In my research, I didn't come across a single person in the U.S.